Something that is not understood is that the colonial system of letters inside of Tanzania and other Swahili regions, and also in Namibia, was influenced highly by the pre colonial postal systems. So, in other words, there were systems inside of West Africa, East Africa that operated, but the ones that were specifically copied were the ones in East Africa, in which the people had runners, and these runners would send letters peer to people, and somehow this was maintained. And the colonialists, the Germans, wanted to understand how this worked. This was something that they actually spent a lot of time studying. It wasn't something like the others where there's vague information or a lot of it is trapped inside oral history. This was something that was written about, documented, and fell inside of the very system of the colonialists until, of course, they created a system that utilized some people who they personally educated inside of their schools. In this short essay called Crude Speeches, meaning really crude speeches or makeshift speeches, the emergence of Shauri as colonial praxis in German East Africa. Now, the word Shauri is a Swahili word, and it meant something like council or coming together or giver of law, something like that. So it had to do with organization of some kind. So this is a paper, and we will see that there's another person who agrees with this person. And they talk about these pre colonial systems that were adopted by these colonialists. So let's read. This paper circles around Bimmeler's argument in the first section. I will show how European travelers produced what I call here practical knowledge, and how this knowledge was later transferred into colonial knowledge in its most literal sense, into knowledge about establishing colonial rule. In the case of the European exploration, such practical knowledge was produced for a very practical goal to travel in Eastern Africa, or more dramatically, to guarantee the traveler surviving. It had to answer questions like how to organize an expedition or caravan, how to recruit and to treat porters, how to obtain food and water, and not in the least, how to negotiate with African porters, traders, and chiefs along the way by trying to find answers to these questions. The European travelers did not reinvent the art of traveling in Eastern Africa, but rather built upon local experiences and knowledge. It's almost impossible to isolate the letter givers in the Swahili coast, as there are so many ways that they did it, and some of them were oral. So, in other words, you're telling someone a message, and then they travel for a while, depending on where the message is going, and then you say it to the other person. Now, these are still official people. In other words, they are people who were paid to do this, not people who were playing around or anything like that. Now, there are people who gave away letters, and of course, we know from people like Vasco da Gama and all these people that some of these letters could reach as far as, from one kingdom to another. We don't need to give specific names because we saw them do it. We saw them organizing with each other to try and capture the Portuguese at one time. But the system of letters that existed was not just limited to porters, it also went overseas. This is how letters would get to people who were located in India, which is one of the things that the Germans noticed when they got there, was that there were always people from India, Arabia, and other places located inside there in case there were messages that needed to go from this place to another. These people were usually traveled through market areas. So, in other words, let's say there's a trade going on between Melinda and Sofala. These letter holders would hitchhike or they would hike on top of these caravans and travel with those people to deliver the letters, even though it was peer to peer, even though it had nothing to do with the king or the queen or that specific market thing or anything. And this is how these systems were made. And this is why it's interesting, because the Germans noticed porters all along the route, meaning that this was a thriving, a booming business. And it was so thriving and useful that they utilized it in their early postal systems in order to create the newer postal systems. And then they copied it and used it in places like Namibia, in places like other places which were part of their holding. So let's carry on reading about this. So, as we continue to read, the traders relied heavily on the cooperation of local people in securing supplies of food and drinking water, as well as for their knowledge about the region. But in the atmosphere of mistrust and violence, the path between peace and war was small. The traders used a lament about the thieving locals, while locals became angry about marauding caravan parties neglecting to pay for food and services provided to them. The arrival of the caravan at the village or residence of an African ruler was therefore a crucial and risky moment. Small incidents could easily provoke full scale wars. Rituals and diplomatic ceremonies called by the traders showery helped to overcome the mutual mistrust and to prepare the space for negotiations. The Shaori emerged in this context as a bricolage of cultural practices of different origins. Shauri is a Swahili word for having a council. However, despite these etymological origins, the Shauri was not only an offspring of the Swahili culture, although it borrowed much from it. If we shift essays and we go and look at Cambridge, we can see there is a essay called Spilling Millet, the East African Post, and the Studied Bureaucratic Knowledge. Now, in here, they talk about how the Germans or the Europeans tried to set up these European postal systems. But not only did they have a problem setting them up, because of course the postal systems are to generate money, and so when they're to generate money, it's good that the locals use them too, as they also have some level of money. But what happened was the locals didn't trust it and continued using their own systems. So they not only were they ancient systems that were already in place, but the newer systems that were faster or whatever also had disadvantages that led to these two systems competing with each other. As we read, in a similar way, East African observing and engaging with the postal service incorporated its material elements and their operation into existing discourses, including cosmological, pathological, and meteorological. They also incorporated the post into existing understandings and methods of message sending and mobility. For long distance communication was certainly nothing new in the region. Stephen Rockel's research on the caravan trade, for instance, detailed a sophisticated system of movement involving coastal capital, inland professional porters, and network of roadside communities, each demonstrating specialized knowledge and recognized expertise. By the mid 19th century, tens of thousands of people moved along these routes every year. The system of long distance trade between coast and interior, moreover, built upon well trodden regional networks established by the mid 18th century, serviced by professional porters from the Yao the Nyamwezi, the Kimbu, and the Sumbwa communities. These existing infrastructures and practices, what Andreas Greiner referred to as vernacular infrastructure, patterned the interventions of the early German colonial state. When Germany committed itself to consolidating control of its colonial territories in the 1890s and early 1900s, it did not simply replace pre existing structures, but most often had to engage, coexist, and even compete with them. The first military posts were built beside the path of trade caravans, and later administrative stations were founded in communities which had long served the trade, even after the fitful start of road building and railway construction, the latter gaining momentum after the Maji Maji War of 1905 to 7. Caravan porters continued to travel known routes in their thousands, combining stretches of travel by rail, government road, and known footpaths. Now, here's the thing that also happened. Once new infrastructure like trains and stuff like that were built, some of these porters that existed in these regions were utilizing some of the new technologies that existed. For example, when trains were introduced, some of these porters would hop on the train and deliver messages in that way. Now, of course, the people had to investigate why would people trust one individual with letters more than they would trust the post office. Now, according to this essay, they found a letter documented which the people sort of explained a worry that the people had. So listen here. It says in one of these essays, the authors deployed a modified version of an aforementioned proverb to describe how some East Africans initially regarded the post office. Walipo kuku wengi mtu haifai kumwaga mchele. Where there are lots of chickens, a person would do well not to spill rice. And this meant the easy writer's interpretation, the proverbs, as a caution against using the post because, in light of everything moving through the busy office, one's message would certainly be lost in the shuffle. It would be swallowed up by busy chickens. Now, the interesting thing is, I noticed a lot of words here that I recognize. Walipo is probably Lapo in Zulu. Kuku is Nkuku, which is chicken. Mtu is probably a human. Okay, so I think they translated that perfectly. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this system was obviously better than the postal system because it wasn't. That's why the postal system eventually won. But I do want to make you understand that it was studied because it was greater than just a bunch of people. Like it's better than, a mother wants to send a message to a kid, so he tells he to another family, so he tells his kid to go take this letter and give it to the other family. It was better than that. It was a system, a controlled system, where there were porters who were everywhere, whose only job was to pass letters, and they were fully aware of the environment and were fully aware of where the thieves are and all this other stuff, so that they acted like the real postal system. And in all the descriptions that I've seen, it was essentially the same thing. Now, of course, once you start adding the ability for trains to carry large amounts of post and all this other stuff, then you start to lose against, how many, no matter how many thousands of people they had, at some point, it's too expensive. It's too much. Now, I didn't even start to explain this type of trade of both food and letters. So we would be in a very good position if people would continue to like, share, and subscribe so that I could upload more videos. I'll call this part one because I I didn't expand on the empires of West Africa and how their ports worked. I promise you they worked very similar to that of the Swahili, but I wanted to give the Swahili example. Otherwise, this video would be 7 hours long if I went through every single African kingdom and how their postal services worked prior to the Europeans. Thank you.